Margaret Thompson had waited 73 years to see Buckingham Palace up close. The elderly woman from Yorkshire clutched her worn leather handbag tightly as she stood behind the iron gates, watching the famous red-coated guards march in perfect formation. Her granddaughter Sarah had brought her to London for her birthday, fulfilling a lifelong dream that began when Margaret was just a little girl, listening to radio broadcasts about the royal family during World War II. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Margaret pressed closer to the railings, her weathered hands gripping the cold metal bars. She had arthritis in both knees and standing for long. Periods was becoming increasingly difficult, but nothing could dampen her excitement. This was the moment she had imagined countless times while working in the textile mills of Bradford, raising 5 children, and caring for her late husband during his final illness. Guard Jonathan Mitchell noticed the elderly woman immediately. 26 years old and 3 years into his service with the Coldstream Guards, he had been trained to maintain absolute stillness and focus during his duties. The bright red tunic, tall black bearskin hat, and polished boots were symbols of centuries of military tradition. His orders were crystal clear: remain motionless, eyes forward, no interaction with the public under any circumstances. But something about Margaret caught his attention. While other tourists snapped photos and chattered excitedly, she simply stood in respectful silence, watching with wonder. Her thin frame was bundled in a faded blue coat that had seen better decades, and sensible walking shoes that suggested this trip had required careful saving and planning. Jonathan could see tears glistening in her eyes as she observed the ceremony with the reverence of someone who truly understood its historical significance. The changing of the guard proceeded with military precision. Commands echoed across the courtyard as the new guards took their positions, while the relieved guards marched away. Margaret followed every movement with rapt attention, occasionally whispering explanations to her granddaughter about the different regiments and their distinctive plumes. Her knowledge impressed even some of the younger tourists nearby, who began listening to her quiet commentary about the Guards Division's role in protecting the sovereign. As the ceremony concluded, most visitors began dispersing toward other London attractions. Margaret remained at the railings, reluctant to end this magical experience. She pulled out a small dog-eared photograph from her handbag, a black-and-white image of her father in his army uniform from the 1940s. He had served in North Africa and always spoke with pride about the British military's traditions and honor. Margaret had promised at his bedside 20 years ago that she would one day visit the palace he had defended from afar. Guard Mitchell's shift was nearly over, but protocol demanded he maintain his position until officially relieved. He watched as Margaret continued to stand alone, her granddaughter having stepped away to make phone calls. The elderly woman seemed lost in memories, occasionally touching the photograph and looking up at the palace windows with deep emotion. Other tourists hurried past her, focused on their next destination, but Margaret appeared content to simply absorb every detail of this once-in-a-lifetime moment. The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the plane trees lining the mall. Margaret's coat fluttered around her slight frame, and Jonathan noticed her shivering slightly. She had clearly dressed for the occasion rather than the weather, choosing her best outfit over practical warmth. Her thin stockings and light coat were no match for the October chill that was settling over London as afternoon approached. Security officers began their routine crowd management, encouraging lingering tourists to keep moving. Margaret looked confused by the gentle but firm requests to clear the area. She clutched her photograph more tightly and took one last long look at the palace facade, memorizing every architectural detail. Her granddaughter returned and took her arm, explaining they needed to head to their next planned stop at Westminster Abbey. As Margaret turned to leave, she stumbled slightly on the uneven pavement near the palace gates. Her age and excitement had combined with hours of standing to make her movements unsteady. Several tourists noticed but continued walking, assuming her granddaughter would provide assistance. Sarah was momentarily distracted, checking her phone for directions to their next destination. Guard Mitchell felt an internal struggle between his strict military training and basic human compassion. Every fiber of his training insisted he remain perfectly still and emotionless. The bearskin hat, the ceremonial rifle, the centuries of tradition, all of it demanded absolute adherence to protocol. Royal Guards were living symbols of British military excellence, not social workers or tour guides. Yet watching Margaret's obvious reverence for the institution he served, combined with her physical vulnerability and clear need for assistance, created an impossible conflict. She represented the very people he had sworn to serve and protect. Her generation had lived through rationing, bombing raids, and decades of sacrifice to preserve the freedoms and traditions that made ceremonies like the changing of the guard possible. The moment stretched endlessly as Margaret steadied herself against the iron railings, clearly embarrassed by her momentary loss of balance. Her cheeks flushed pink with both cold and mortification. She whispered an apology to no one in particular, the lifetime habit of someone who had been taught never to make a fuss or draw attention to herself. Jonathan Mitchell stood frozen between duty and humanity, between protocol and kindness, between military tradition and simple human decency. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed heavier than usual as he watched an elderly woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor the very institution he represented struggle with something as basic as maintaining her balance on an unforgiving London sidewalk. The palace loomed behind him, centuries of history and protocol seeming to press down on his shoulders. But in front of him stood Margaret Thompson, a living reminder that all the pageantry and tradition existed to serve real people with real needs, real dreams, and real moments of vulnerability that sometimes required someone to care more about humanity than regulations. Jonathan Mitchell made a decision that would define his military career. Breaking centuries of protocol, he stepped forward from his post and gently took Margaret's arm to steady her. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with Royal Guard procedures. His fellow guards maintained their positions, but Jonathan could sense their surprise at his unprecedented breach of regulations. Margaret looked up in astonishment as the tall guard in his magnificent red tunic offered support. His face remained professionally composed, but his eyes held genuine concern and kindness. She had never expected such personal attention from one of these legendary figures she had admired from afar for so many decades. The moment felt surreal, as if she had stepped into a fairy tale where the stoic palace guardians came to life to help ordinary people. "Are you quite all right, madam?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice barely audible to prevent attracting more attention from tourists and security personnel. His training in proper speech and deportment served him well as he maintained dignity while offering assistance. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of genuine human concern that transcended his official role. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Oh, my goodness, yes, dear. Thank you so much," she whispered back, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Her Yorkshire accent seemed more pronounced in her emotional state, and she gripped his strong arm with surprising firmness. "I've dreamed of this day for so long, and you've made it even more special than I ever imagined possible." Sarah rushed back to her grandmother's side, initially alarmed to see a royal guard apparently abandoning his post to help Margaret. She had read about the strict protocols surrounding these ceremonial soldiers and worried that her grandmother might have somehow caused trouble. But seeing the genuine care in the guard's demeanor quickly replaced her concern with amazement at this extraordinary gesture of humanity. Jonathan helped Margaret navigate the uneven stones near the palace entrance, his movements careful and deliberate. He had been trained in first aid and crowd control, but nothing in his military education had prepared him for this delicate balance between maintaining dignity and providing compassionate assistance to an elderly civilian. Every step required him to consider both Margaret's safety and the potential consequences of his actions. Other tourists began noticing the unprecedented interaction. Some pulled out cameras, recognizing they were witnessing something truly unusual in the normally rigid world of royal protocol. A few elderly visitors in the crowd smiled knowingly, perhaps recognizing themselves in Margaret's situation and appreciating the guard's compassionate response to her needs. Palace security officers observed the situation with professional interest, but made no immediate move to intervene. They recognized Guard Mitchell as a reliable soldier with an exemplary service record who would not act without good reason. The fact that he was clearly helping rather than confronting a visitor suggested the situation required careful assessment. Rather than immediate action, Margaret's granddaughter introduced herself quietly to Jonathan. "I'm Sarah, and this is my grandmother, Margaret Thompson. We've come down from Yorkshire for her birthday. She's been saving for this trip for years, and meeting the royal guards has been her biggest dream." Sarah's explanation provided context. That helped justify Jonathan's decision to break protocol in the eyes of any observing officials. "It's an honor to meet you both," Jonathan replied with sincere warmth while maintaining his professional bearing. He had grown up hearing stories from his own grandfather about the sacrifices made by Margaret's generation during the war years. These elderly visitors weren't just tourists to him. They were living links to the history and values his regiment was sworn to protect and honor. As they walked slowly toward a nearby bench where Margaret could rest, Jonathan shared brief comments about the palace architecture and the guard's history. His knowledge was extensive, gained through years of study and service, but he presented it in simple terms that enhanced Margaret's appreciation without overwhelming her. Each detail he shared felt like a precious gift to the elderly woman who had waited a lifetime for this experience. Margaret listened with rapt attention to every word, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her genuine interest in royal history and military traditions. Her questions were insightful, revealing decades of reading and learning about the subjects she was now experiencing firsthand. Jonathan found himself impressed by her knowledge and moved by her obvious respect for the institution he served. The bench provided welcome relief for Margaret's aching joints, and she settled gratefully while maintaining her grip on the faded photograph of her father. She showed it to Jonathan, explaining his military service and her promise to visit the palace on his behalf. The guard studied the image respectfully, recognizing the uniform and understanding immediately why this visit held such deep, personal significance for Margaret. "Your father would be very proud of you for keeping that promise," Jonathan said softly, handing back the precious photograph. His words carried the weight of one soldier honoring another across the decades, acknowledging the sacrifices made by previous generations. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a worn handkerchief, overwhelmed by the unexpected validation of her father's service and her own long-held dream. Palace staff members began taking notice of the extended interaction between guard and visitor. Some watched with curiosity, others with concern about potential rule violations. Jonathan was acutely aware of the attention his actions were generating, but his commitment to helping Margaret override his concerns about possible disciplinary consequences. This was bigger than regulations. It was about honoring the very people those regulations were designed to serve. Sarah captured several photos of her grandmother sitting beside the royal guard, understanding instinctively that these images would become treasured family heirlooms. The pictures showed Margaret's joy and gratitude, alongside Jonathan's quiet dignity and kindness. These would be the photos that told the real story of their London visit, more meaningful than any standard tourist snapshots. As Margaret rested, other elderly tourists approached tentatively, drawn by the unprecedented accessibility of a royal guard. Jonathan found himself in the unusual position of becoming an impromptu ambassador for his regiment, answering questions and sharing historical information with a small group of senior citizens who had clearly been hoping for exactly this kind of personal connection with British military tradition. Within minutes, word of the unusual scene spread through the palace grounds. Senior Guard William Harrison, a 15-year veteran with multiple commendations, approached to assess the situation. His initial instinct was to restore proper protocol immediately, but as he drew closer and observed the genuine interaction between Jonathan and the elderly visitors, he found himself reconsidering his usual by-the-book response to rule violations. Margaret noticed the approaching senior guard and immediately worried that she had gotten Jonathan into trouble. Her face showed concern and embarrassment as she began to apologize profusely for any problems she might have caused. "Oh, dear. I hope I haven't caused any difficulties for this lovely young man," she said anxiously, starting to stand despite her obvious discomfort and fatigue. Harrison had seen thousands of tourists during his career, but something about Margaret's genuine distress and obvious respect for military protocol touched him deeply. Instead of reprimanding Mitchell, he found himself asking about Margaret's journey to London and her connection to the palace. Her story of saving money, traveling from Yorkshire, and honoring her father's memory resonated with his own family's military history. "Please don't worry, madam," Harrison assured Margaret with unexpected gentleness. "Guard Mitchell was quite right to ensure your safety and comfort. That's what we're here for, after all." His words surprised not only Margaret, but also several junior guards who had never seen their strict supervisor show such flexibility regarding protocol violations. The senior guard's approval transformed the situation entirely. What had begun as a potential disciplinary incident became a sanctioned moment of human connection between the guards and the public they served. Harrison's decision sent ripples through the palace staff, many of whom had never witnessed such a departure from established procedures. Margaret's relief was visible as she realized she hadn't caused problems for Jonathan. She began sharing more details about her journey, including the months of saving money by skipping meals and entertainment, the careful planning required for someone with limited mobility, and the emotional significance of fulfilling her promise to her late father. Her story painted a picture of determination and sacrifice that resonated deeply with both guards. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, drawn by the unprecedented sight of royal guards engaging in extended conversation with civilians. Among them were other elderly visitors who watched with hope and wonder, perhaps seeing possibilities for their own interactions with these legendary figures. The atmosphere became charged with possibility as rigid barriers between guards and public seemed to dissolve. Jonathan helped Margaret stand when she expressed interest in moving closer to the palace gates for a better view of the architecture. His assistance was no longer furtive or concerned about protocol violations. With senior approval, he could focus entirely on ensuring Margaret's comfort and enhancing her experience without worrying about career consequences. Harrison noticed other elderly tourists in the crowd who appeared to be struggling with the physical demands of sightseeing. An elderly gentleman leaned heavily on a walking stick, clearly tired from standing. A woman in her 80s clutched her husband's arm for support while trying to get a clear view through the crowd of younger, taller visitors who blocked her sight line. Making another unprecedented decision, Harrison quietly directed 2 additional guards to assist other elderly visitors who appeared to need help. The ripple effect of kindness spread as more members of the guards broke from their traditional stoic silence to offer assistance, directions, and even brief historical commentary to senior citizens who had traveled far to witness the pageantry. Margaret found herself at the center of an extraordinary transformation. The usually distant and unapproachable royal guards had become accessible human beings, sharing stories and knowledge while maintaining their dignity and professionalism. She felt like an honored guest, rather than just another tourist, and the experience exceeded every dream she had harbored about visiting Buckingham Palace. Palace officials observing from windows above found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in modern royal guard history. Phone calls were made and discussions held about whether to intervene and restore normal protocol or allow this remarkable display of public relations to continue. The positive reactions from visitors and the obvious boost to Britain's international image complicated what should have been a straightforward disciplinary situation. Sarah documented the extraordinary scene with her camera, understanding that her grandmother was experiencing something that would likely never happen again. The photos showed royal guards in their magnificent uniforms, kneeling to speak with elderly visitors, offering arms for support, and sharing gentle smiles that humanized these usually intimidating figures of British military tradition. Margaret asked Jonathan about the specific history of his regiment, the significance of different uniform details, and the daily life of a royal guard. His answers were informative and respectful, delivered with the same precision he applied to military drills, but warmed by genuine enthusiasm for sharing knowledge with someone who truly appreciated it. Other elderly tourists approached tentatively, emboldened by the welcoming atmosphere that had replaced the usual intimidating formality. Soon, Harrison found himself coordinating an impromptu educational session where multiple guards shared information about royal protocol, military history, and the significance of various ceremonies with a growing group of senior citizens. The transformation was remarkable. Guards who had been trained to ignore public interaction found themselves energized by the grateful responses of elderly visitors who had never expected such personal attention. The mutual respect and appreciation flowed both ways, creating connections that transcended the usual barriers between military personnel and civilians. Margaret's joy was infectious, and her obvious delight in the experience began influencing the mood of everyone around her. Young tourists stopped to listen to the historical information being shared. Children became more respectful in the presence of elderly visitors being honored by the guards, and the entire atmosphere around the palace gates shifted towards something more welcoming and inclusive. As the afternoon progressed, what had begun as a single act of kindness toward one elderly woman evolved into a broader demonstration of the human side of British military tradition. The guards maintained their dignity and professionalism while showing that compassion and protocol could coexist when the situation truly warranted such flexibility. News of the extraordinary events at Buckingham Palace reached the highest levels of the royal household within hours. Private Secretary Sir Edward Pemberton found himself reviewing reports and photographs of royal guards abandoning centuries-old protocol to assist elderly visitors. His initial concern about breach of regulations gradually gave way to recognition that something remarkable and positive was occurring at the palace gates. Margaret's story had spread beyond the immediate crowd through social media posts by impressed tourists. Images of the dignified elderly woman being assisted by red-coated guards went viral across multiple platforms, generating overwhelmingly positive responses from people around the world. Comments poured in from veterans, elderly citizens, and military families who saw the guards' actions as embodying the very best of British values and military honor. The palace's head of security, Colonel James Reed, conducted a thorough review of the situation. His investigation revealed that the guards' actions, while technically violations of standing orders, had resulted in no security breaches, no disruption to official functions, and no negative consequences of any kind. Instead, the incident had generated unprecedented positive publicity for the monarchy and the British military. Margaret remained unaware of the wider implications of her visit as she continued to enjoy her extraordinary afternoon with the guards. Jonathan had arranged for her to have a clear view of the next changing ceremony, positioning her where she could see every detail without being jostled by crowds. His thoughtfulness extended to bringing her a cup of tea from the palace staff. Facilities, a gesture that moved her to tears of gratitude. The ripple effects of the guards' kindness continued expanding throughout the day. Other military units stationed in London heard about the events at Buckingham Palace, and senior officers began discussing the balance between maintaining military discipline and showing appropriate compassion to the public they served. The conversation reached the highest levels of the Ministry of Defense. Sarah watched her grandmother's transformation with amazement. Margaret seemed to have shed 20 years, her posture straighter, her voice stronger, her eyes brighter than Sarah had seen in years. The validation and respect she was receiving from these symbols of British tradition had restored something essential in her spirit. The trip that began as a birthday gift was becoming a life-changing experience. Harrison made the decision to contact his commanding officer directly, explaining the situation before it could be reported through other channels. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thorne listened to the account with growing interest, recognizing both the rule violations and the extraordinary positive outcomes. His military experience included situations where rigid adherence to protocol served no useful purpose and could actually harm the mission. Margaret's interaction with the guards had attracted attention from British media representatives who happened to be in the area covering other royal events. Reporters and photographers began documenting the story, recognizing its human interest value and broader significance for public relations between the military and civilians. The coverage would eventually reach international news outlets. The elderly woman from Yorkshire found herself becoming an inadvertent ambassador for her generation's relationship with British military traditions. Her genuine appreciation and knowledge impressed not only the guards but also younger tourists who began asking her questions about royal history and military heritage. Margaret discovered she enjoyed sharing her knowledge and passion with others. Jonathan's fellow guards approached him during brief moments between official duties, expressing curiosity about his decision to break protocol and admiration for the positive results. Some admitted they had wanted to help elderly or disabled visitors in the past, but had been too concerned about regulations to act. The afternoon's events were changing perspectives throughout the regiment. Palace staff members, who had initially worried about the protocol breaches, found themselves moved by Margaret's story and the guards' compassionate response. Kitchen staff who had provided the tea, maintenance workers who had helped arrange seating, and administrative personnel who had facilitated the unusual arrangements all became part of the growing network of palace employees touched by the elderly woman's journey. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the palace courtyard as Margaret prepared for her departure. The day had lasted far longer than originally planned, but every moment had been precious. She had spoken with multiple guards, learned historical details she had never known, and felt welcomed into a world she had only imagined from afar. Jonathan presented Margaret with a small, unofficial memento, a brass button from his uniform that had been replaced during routine maintenance. It wasn't an official souvenir, but rather a personal gesture of respect from one person to another. Margaret accepted it with trembling hands, understanding that this simple object represented validation of her father's service and her own lifelong devotion to British military tradition. The gathering crowd of supporters included tourists from multiple countries who had witnessed the extraordinary interactions between guards and elderly visitors. Many expressed that seeing such humanity and kindness from these iconic figures had changed their perceptions of British culture and military personnel. The impromptu cultural exchange was generating goodwill that extended far beyond tourism. Harrison coordinated with palace security to ensure that Margaret's departure would be as memorable as her arrival. The guards arranged themselves to provide an informal but dignified farewell that acknowledged her special status while maintaining appropriate military bearing. The gesture was unprecedented but felt entirely appropriate given the extraordinary circumstances. As word of the event spread through London's tourist networks, other elderly visitors began arriving at the palace gates with hopes of experiencing similar treatment. The guards found themselves facing increased expectations for personal interaction while still needing to maintain security and protocol for official functions. The afternoon's kindness had created new challenges that would need careful management. Margaret's granddaughter documented every moment of the extended farewell, understanding that these images and memories would become family treasures. The photos showed not just tourist snapshots, but historical documentation of a moment when rigid military protocol gave way to human compassion and connection. The elderly woman's impact on the guards was equally profound. Many reported feeling more connected to their purpose and mission after experiencing the genuine gratitude and respect from someone who truly understood the significance of their service. Margaret had reminded them that their role extended beyond ceremonial duties to representing the very best of British values and military tradition. The following morning brought unexpected developments that would change Royal Guard protocol forever. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne arrived at Buckingham Palace to personally investigate the previous day's events, accompanied by senior officials from the Ministry of Defense and representatives from the royal household. Their mission was to determine whether disciplinary action was warranted or if the Guard's actions represented a positive evolution in public relations. Margaret woke in her London hotel room to find her granddaughter showing her newspaper headlines and internet articles about their palace visit. The elderly woman was astounded to discover that their private, meaningful experience had captured international attention and generated thousands of supportive comments from people around the world. She had become an overnight symbol of intergenerational respect and military honor. News reports featured interviews with military historians who praised the Guard's actions as reflecting the true spirit of British military values. Veterans organizations issued statements supporting the decision to prioritize human compassion over rigid protocol. The overwhelming public response was positive, with many calling for formal recognition of the Guards who had shown such exemplary judgment and kindness. Jonathan Mitchell found himself summoned to meet with his commanding officers, uncertain whether he faced commendation or court-martial. His fellow Guards offered quiet words of support as he prepared for what could be a career-defining conversation. The young soldier had acted from the heart, but military careers had been destroyed by smaller violations of protocol. The meeting took an unexpected turn when Lieutenant Colonel Thorne began by commending Mitchell's actions rather than censuring them. The senior officer had reviewed video footage, read witness statements, and analyzed the overwhelmingly positive public response to conclude that the Guard's judgment had been exemplary under unique circumstances. The decision to help Margaret, Thompson represented military values at their finest. Senior Guard Harrison also found himself under scrutiny, but his 15-year record of exceptional service and his thoughtful management of the unprecedented situation earned praise rather than punishment. His decision to support Mitchell and coordinate assistance for other elderly visitors demonstrated the kind of leadership that military organizations value most, the ability to adapt regulations to serve higher purposes. Palace officials revealed that they had received hundreds of phone calls and emails from people inspired by the Guard's actions. Many were elderly veterans and their families who felt that Margaret's treatment represented validation of their own service and sacrifice. The positive publicity had enhanced Britain's international reputation and strengthened public support for the monarchy and military. Margaret was invited to return to Buckingham Palace for a formal meeting with senior officials who wanted to thank her personally for her grace and dignity during the extraordinary events. The invitation represented unprecedented recognition for an ordinary citizen whose simple dream had inadvertently transformed royal protocol. She was both honored and overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. The ripple effects continued spreading throughout British military establishments. Other ceremonial units at locations like Windsor Castle, Edinburgh Castle, and the Tower of London began receiving new guidance about balancing protocol with appropriate compassion for elderly and disabled visitors. Margaret's story was becoming a catalyst for broader changes in military-civilian relations. Television networks from multiple countries requested interviews with Margaret, eager to explore her background and understand what had made her story so compelling to global audiences. The elderly woman from Yorkshire found herself representing not just her own experiences, but the entire generation that had lived through World War II and its aftermath. Jonathan learned that his actions had earned him a formal commendation rather than disciplinary action. The recognition acknowledged his ability to maintain military bearing while showing appropriate compassion, demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment and character the guards sought in their personnel. His career prospects had been enhanced, rather than damaged by his moment of humanity. The story reached members of Parliament, who raised questions about military protocol and public access during parliamentary sessions. Defense Minister Patricia Worthington publicly praised the Guards' actions and announced a review of ceremonial procedures to ensure they balanced tradition with appropriate accessibility for elderly and disabled visitors. Margaret's second visit to the palace was arranged with full official support, including transportation, security arrangements, and a private tour usually reserved for dignitaries. The transformation from ordinary tourist to honored guest represented a remarkable journey that began with a simple act of kindness from a young guard who saw beyond his uniform to his fundamental humanity. The brass button Jonathan had given. Margaret became a cherished symbol of their connection and the broader changes their interaction had inspired. She had it professionally mounted with a photograph from their first meeting, creating a lasting memorial to a moment when protocol gave way to human decency and genuine respect across generational lines. Media coverage expanded beyond the immediate story to explore broader themes about aging, military service, and the importance of honoring elderly citizens who had sacrificed for their nations. Margaret's journey became a lens through which society examined its treatment of senior citizens and veterans, generating discussions about respect, accessibility, and intergenerational understanding. The guards involved in the original incident found themselves receiving recognition from unexpected sources. Veterans groups, senior citizens organizations, and military families across Britain and beyond sent letters of appreciation. The young soldiers had demonstrated that military excellence included the wisdom to know when humanity should take precedence over regulations. Palace tour guides began incorporating Margaret's story into their presentations, using it as an example of how royal traditions could adapt to serve their true purpose of honoring the people they were created to protect. The story became part of the official narrative about the Guards' role in British society, demonstrating that strength and compassion were not contradictory values. Sarah documented her grandmother's second palace visit with the same care she had shown during the first, but this time as invited guests rather than ordinary tourists. The contrast was remarkable. What had begun as a dream fulfilled through determination and saving had evolved into official recognition of Margaret's dignity and the universal values she represented. The elderly woman's impact extended beyond the immediate participants to influence training programs for new guards. Military instructors began using the Margaret Thompson incident as a case study in situational awareness, appropriate response to civilian needs, and the balance between protocol and humanity. Future generations of guards would learn from this moment of exceptional judgment. International military delegations visiting London requested briefings about the protocol changes inspired by Margaret's visit. The story had become a model for how traditional military organizations could maintain discipline while showing appropriate flexibility when circumstances warranted compassion. The British approach was being studied and potentially adopted by other nations. Margaret's influence on Royal Guard procedures created lasting changes that would benefit countless future visitors. Special provisions were established for elderly and disabled tourists, including designated viewing areas, seating options, and trained personnel to provide assistance when needed. Her single visit had improved accessibility for thousands of people who would follow in her footsteps. 1 year later, Margaret Thompson returned to Buckingham Palace for a very different kind of ceremony. She had been invited as a special guest to witness the formal implementation of the new accessibility protocols that had been inspired by her original visit. The changes included designated areas for elderly visitors, trained assistance personnel, and modified procedures that balanced tradition with compassion. The transformation was remarkable. Where once elderly tourists had struggled to see ceremonies from behind crowds of younger visitors, there were now reserved sections with seating and clear sight lines. Guards had been trained to recognize when visitors needed assistance and were authorized to provide help within clearly defined parameters. Margaret's single act of stumbling near the palace gates had created a ripple effect that improved the experience for thousands of people. Jonathan Mitchell, now promoted to corporal, served as Margaret's personal escort during her return visit. The young man who had risked his career to help a struggling elderly woman had become a model for the new approach to guard civilian interactions. His promotion had been accelerated partly in recognition of his exemplary judgment during the original incident. The ceremony attracted international media attention, with news outlets from around the world covering the formal recognition of Margaret's impact on royal protocol. She had become a symbol of how ordinary citizens could inspire positive change through their dignity and grace, even in situations where they held no official power or influence. Sarah watched her grandmother accept a special recognition award from palace officials with pride and amazement. The woman who had saved for years to afford a single trip to London now found herself honored at the highest levels of British society. The recognition validated not just Margaret's personal journey, but the experiences and sacrifices of her entire generation. The award ceremony included testimonials from other elderly visitors who had benefited from the new protocols. Veterans, widows, and senior tourists shared stories of feeling welcomed and respected during their palace visits, creating a powerful narrative about the importance of accessibility and dignity for aging populations. Margaret's speech at the ceremony was brief but moving. She spoke about her father's military service, her lifelong dream of visiting the palace, and her amazement at how a simple act of kindness from a young guard had created such far-reaching changes. Her words reflected the humility and grace that had originally captured Jonathan's attention and inspired his compassionate response. The brass button from Jonathan's uniform, now professionally displayed in a frame alongside photographs from both visits, had become a family heirloom representing the power of human connection across generational and social boundaries. Margaret planned to leave it to Sarah with instructions that it should remind future generations about the importance of kindness and respect for elderly citizens. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne presented Margaret with an honorary regimental pin, making her the first civilian to receive such recognition from the Coldstream Guards. The gesture acknowledged her role in inspiring positive changes that had enhanced the regiment's relationship with the public while maintaining its proud military traditions. The new protocols had been studied and adopted by other ceremonial military units throughout Britain and internationally. Margaret's story had become a case study in military academies and public administration programs, demonstrating how individual acts of kindness could catalyze institutional change and improve public service delivery. Palace statistics showed significant increases in positive visitor feedback and improved accessibility ratings since implementing the Margaret Thompson protocols. The changes had enhanced Britain's reputation as a welcoming destination for elderly tourists, generating both goodwill and economic benefits from increased senior tourism. Jonathan had received multiple commendations and speaking invitations, but he consistently credited Margaret with teaching him the most important lesson of his military career, that true strength lay in knowing when to bend rules in service of higher values. Their ongoing friendship represented a bridge between military tradition and civilian appreciation that enriched both their lives. The ripple effects continued expanding as Margaret's story inspired similar changes in other public institutions. Museums, historical sites, and government buildings across Britain began implementing improved accessibility measures and training programs that emphasized respectful treatment of elderly visitors. As the ceremony concluded, Margaret took one final walk around the palace grounds with Jonathan as her guide. The elderly woman who had once struggled to maintain her balance near the iron gates now moved with confidence through areas that had been made accessible partly because of her influence. The transformation was both personal and institutional. The Afternoon sun cast the same golden light that had illuminated Margaret's first visit, but everything else had changed. Where once she had been an anonymous tourist, hoping for a glimpse of royal pageantry, she was now an honored guest whose dignity and grace had inspired lasting improvements in how Britain treated its senior citizens and veterans. Margaret's final words to Jonathan captured the essence of their extraordinary relationship and its broader significance. "You taught me that kindness never goes out of style, dear boy, and that the best traditions are those that remember to put people first." The young guard, who had risked everything to help a struggling elderly woman, had discovered that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the simplest acts of human decency. The story of Margaret Thompson and the Royal Guards had become a permanent part of British military and royal history, demonstrating that institutions built on honor and service must always remember their fundamental purpose: protecting and serving the people who give those institutions their meaning and legitimacy. Her legacy would inspire future generations of guards to see beyond protocol to the humanity they were sworn to serve. As Margaret returned to Yorkshire for the final time, she carried with her not just memories and mementos, but the knowledge that her simple dream had created lasting positive change for countless others. The elderly woman who had saved pennies to visit Buckingham Palace had given Britain something far more valuable than money: a reminder that true nobility lies in how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society with dignity, respect, and compassion.